Please pray with me. Lord, we seek your guidance, and sometimes you give it through the stories of your people. Please open our hearts to receive it today. Amen. You may be seated. I have a confession to make, and I apologize if I step on your toes a little bit, but there is a particular group of people who really just confuse me. It's those people who say they never watch TV. I know they say that there are more important things to do, and I get that. I'm just not sure we can still be friends. I work hard, I promise I do, but my guilty pleasure is watching a good Netflix true crime series, and I like to binge it. I just love unplugging for a little bit, and the true crime stuff is perfect because no matter how awful the crime is, the guilty people are found and they have to face the consequences, and it all usually gets wrapped up in an hour. It's perfect. One of my latest binges was a little bit different, though. The town I grew up in is now Netflix famous, and not in a good way. There's a new series called The Innocent Man, and it's based on an adaptation of a book by John Grisham. And it's all set in my hometown of Ada, Oklahoma. There were only 127 of us in my graduating class, so it's fair to say we knew each other's business. Christy was one of my friends, and I remember when we were in about 8th grade, she brought a new book to school called The Dreams of Ada. And the book chronicled 2 violently fatal crimes that had happened a few years before. And Christy's older cousin, Debbie, had been the victim of one of them. It was awful. And we were shocked at the details, but right about the time the book came out, 2 men were convicted of the crime, and everything seemed to be resolved. Christy and her whole family were able to place all their anger right where it belonged, on the shoulders of those 2 guilty men, and the justice system ensured they'd never hurt anyone again. We made it through all of high school and college, knowing that Debbie's perpetrators were behind bars, and our lives went on. Until about 4 years after we graduated from college. One of the men had contacted the Innocence Project. DNA testing had improved, and we were all completely shocked to learn that those 2 men had been wrongfully convicted. There had been many police mistakes and likely some intentional tampering with the investigation. So much had been taken away from them. Those 2 men spent 12 years in jail, one of them on death row, for a crime they didn't commit. What do you do when you're wronged like that? How do you move on without getting bogged down in hate and mistrust? Wrongful incarceration might seem like a modern-day issue, but this story is nothing new. In fact, one of our readings today is from Genesis 45, and this story may have even more drama than any Netflix series out there. We pick up at the tail end of the story of Joseph, so let me back it up for you and give you a little context. Jacob, also known as Israel, had 12 sons, but Joseph was by far his favorite. Joseph was the firstborn son to Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel. Now, Jacob had also married Rachel's sister and had kids with 2 other ladies, but that's a whole different kind of drama. Jacob wasn't subtle about his favoritism of Joseph. You might remember that the coat of many colors was a gift he gave him. And Joseph didn't help matters at all by being a bit of a tattletale. He also bragged that he had had not 1, but 2 dreams in which all of his brothers would one day bow down to him, and he'd rule over them. By the time Joseph was a teenager, it was no big surprise that his older half-brothers hated him. They didn't just dislike him. They hated him to the degree that they contemplated killing him and finally settled on just faking his death and selling him into slavery. The brothers told their father Jacob that his favorite son was dead, but we know that Joseph had actually been purchased by a traveling caravan and was now serving as a slave in Egypt under Potiphar, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. Even as a slave, Joseph worked hard, and by the time he was 30, he had been promoted to head of Potiphar's household. And then the rug was ripped out from under him again. As if it's not bad enough to be betrayed by your own brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph is then falsely accused of assaulting his boss's wife and thrown into prison. Joseph had been hated by his brothers, sold into slavery, and even though he still conducted himself honorably, he was slandered and falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and he ended up in prison. And then they forgot about him for 2 years. It may seem like an overly dramatic, made-for-TV set of events, but remember, Joseph was a regular person, just like you and me. In spite of his best efforts, life just didn't seem to go his way. Betrayal and disappointment seemed to follow him. Turn-of-the-century evangelist F.B. Meyer recognizes that many of us can relate to Joseph's situation when he says, "You who have been misunderstood, who have sown seeds of holiness and love, to reap nothing but disappointment, loss, suffering, and hate, you know something of what Joseph felt in that wretched dungeon hole." Now, maybe you weren't wrongfully incarcerated, but perhaps you've loved others the best you could and received anything but love in return. How do you move on when you've been wronged like that? Our gospel reading today almost sounds trite in circumstances like these, but I think there really is something we can learn there. So if you'd grab the Pew Bible and take a look at page 862. It's Luke chapter 6. Jesus is preaching to a crowd, and he's giving examples of what it means to live into God's best for our lives. And he clearly addresses how we should treat those who have wronged us. In chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you." He goes on to give more examples of how to love our enemies, and then down in verse 32, he states an obvious truth that we might not want to hear. He reminds us that it's easy to love the lovable, to do good for those who do good to us. But if we want to be set apart as his, we will be different. We will love our enemies, expecting nothing in return. English writer and theologian G.K. Chesterton noted that the Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because they're generally the same people. So who's your enemy? Maybe you have been severely hurt and you can already picture them. Their name is at the tip of your tongue. But maybe enemy seems like a really strong word. Is there someone that rubs you the wrong way? Raises your blood pressure? Someone you'd go out of your way to avoid or pretend you just didn't see if you ended up on the same aisle at the store? Maybe someone you scroll right past on social media, but you have heated conversations with them, if only in your head. Did someone's face pop in your mind? Here's the kicker. Jesus not only assumes we'll have someone we're in conflict with, he made it plural. Love your enemies. He assumes we'll have more than one. Our enemies may be people who have intentionally hurt us, or they may be people who honestly have no idea that they make our lives harder. Jesus knew we couldn't live in this broken world without accumulating a few enemies along the way. He doesn't question whether or not we'll have them. He assumes we do, and then he tells us to love them. That sounds well and good, but how do you just decide to love someone? I struggle most with loving people who've hurt someone I care about. It's far easier for me to forgive something that was done directly to me, but when my people are hurt, that's when I struggle most. But Jesus didn't give us that exception. We don't get a pass just because we think we're being loyal. I may not be overtly mean to someone or try to hurt them. My MO is much more often to just withdraw my affection. But Jesus isn't telling us to just refrain from engaging in warfare with the enemy. He's telling us to lean in and to love. I'd imagine Jesus knew we would struggle with this, so he actually gives us some specifics on how to do it. In verse 27, he says, "Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you." Do you notice that all the examples Jesus gives of ways to love our enemies are all action-oriented? That actually makes me feel a lot better. We don't have to try in vain to manufacture warm, fuzzy feelings. Jesus just calls us to act in certain ways for the benefit of the other person. To do good for them, to bless them, to pray for them. Jesus is also clear that there are to be no prerequisites to our love. It's not contingent on the other person's acknowledgement that they hurt us. Now, we might not have chosen to make it this way, but God's pretty clear about this one. We don't get to wait for an apology or until someone deserves our love. Those are two completely different things, and one is not dependent on the other. We are to be merciful as God is merciful. We know from Romans 5:8 that God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus even addresses it right here in our passage today. In Luke 6, verse 35, we're reminded that God is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. And we're called to be merciful, just as God is merciful to us. If grace is getting a gift that we don't deserve, mercy is not getting a consequence that we do deserve. And God set the example, and he extended mercy to us. We didn't deserve it. We don't deserve it. And yet, we receive his grace and mercy again and again. If we truly desire to be made more and more in the image of Christ, well, then he's set an example for us to follow. His way really is better. Not just for those we extend love to, but for us too. Nelson Mandela, after spending 27 years in prison, said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." Those instructions to love, do good, bless, and pray can turn what was meant for evil into good, for our enemies and for us. Well before Christ's instructions to us, we see it play out clearly in the life of Joseph. Remember, Joseph had been falsely accused and put in prison, but God had gifted him with the ability to interpret dreams. And eventually, even after being forgotten for a couple of years, it proved to be his get-out-of-jail card. Joseph correctly predicted a season of great prosperity, followed by a season of great famine, and Pharaoh was so impressed that he appointed Joseph second in command and made him in charge of all of the storing up of the food for the upcoming famine years. Meanwhile, back in Canaan, some 2 decades after he thought he'd lost his favorite son, the famine threatened Jacob's entire family. So he sent some of his remaining sons down to Egypt to buy food. When the brothers got there asking for food, they were brought before Joseph since he was now in charge of everything. Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, even after 20 years. But they didn't recognize him. Incidentally, remember how teenage Joseph had bragged about the dream where his brothers would one day bow down before him? Well, they did. After all this time, Joseph likely thought he would never have to see them again. I can only imagine he needed some time to process what was going on, and maybe that's part of the reason why he didn't immediately tell them who he was. In fact, he tested them, tricked them really, to see if they had changed. He treated them as spies and put them in jail. And then when he did release them, he kept one brother back for ransom and framed another for robbery. He left them hanging for a little while, so I'm not so sure forgiveness came easy for Joseph either. I get that. I think it's natural in some way to want some vengeance or justice, to want the people who've hurt us to feel just a little bit of pain themselves. I know sometimes I do. But Jesus is telling us to do the unnatural, to extend mercy even when human nature tells us not to. Joseph was no longer a young victim. He had all the power, and he could have destroyed those who hurt him and been viewed as righteous in doing so. They had betrayed him in such a profound way, and I don't know what I would have done in his place. Joseph may have struggled initially, but our passage today in Genesis 45 tells us that Joseph eventually did what Jesus is now telling us to do. He loved them. He kissed his brothers and wept over them. He spent time with them and he talked with them. He did good for them. He gave them land and provided for their physical needs in incredibly generous ways. The Bible doesn't mention it, but I'd imagine Joseph prayed for them. He had longed to see his father again, and eventually they were reunited. He blessed them. Joseph could have used his power to curse them or to bless them. And he recognized that even though they intended to harm him, God used it for good. He not only blessed his brothers, but he blessed generations to come. I heard a quote once that said, "The currency of evil is passed from one hand to the next until one person refuses to pass it on." That was Joseph. He stopped the cycle of pain and anger. He kept their family from becoming the original Hatfields and McCoys, and that is an amazing legacy. Jesus doesn't say these instructions are only for those big things. They're for all the things. Recently, I was across a counter from an employee who was clearly not loving her job. She was rude and making things unnecessarily difficult for me and for the other people in line. The man in front of me got so frustrated that he eventually burst out in anger, and the whole situation got worse for both of them. Since this was all at the top of my mind, I decided to practice. I kept my facial expressions in check. Miraculous, I know. And I greeted each rude remark with a genuine smile and calm compliance with her requests. even though she was clearly in the wrong. I was sincerely trying to diffuse the situation with my actions. Surprisingly to me, I got even calmer and more peaceful. And so did she. As I walked away, I could still hear her interaction with the next person in line, and there was a marked difference. What had been an increasingly adversarial situation was now sliding back down into peace, if not even helpfulness. It really was interesting to be intentional and just watch it unfold. We broke the cycle. In a very small way, I know, but it was still palpable and good for us both and the people we would each encounter next. My friend Christy broke the cycle too. She now works closely with the Oklahoma Death Penalty Review Commission, and she hosts a monthly support group for people impacted by wrongful convictions. She's redeeming her pain and loving, doing good for, and greatly blessing those God places in her path. Whether you have big enemies on your mind or just everyday annoyances, I encourage you to just see if maybe Jesus is on to something here. Love your enemies. Do good for them. Bless them. Pray for them. You don't have to do it because you feel like it. In fact, you probably won't. But do it because you want to be a little more like Jesus. They may not even realize what you're doing, and that's okay. It's not about them. It's about you being faithful to what Jesus is asking you to do. You may just be surprised with the ways he blesses your efforts, all for his glory. Amen.